Welcome. Thank you. Good morning. Still morning. I'm Brad Rourke. I'm Chief External Affairs Officer for the Charles F. Kettering Foundation. I'm proud to welcome you to our latest Kettering Conversation on democracy. Democracy is not partisan. I'm looking forward to an amazing conversation featuring a number of our senior and named fellows and other outstanding figures whom you'll get to know. We have a full room. It's going to be full in a moment, and we have hundreds who've tuned in on Zoom, so I'll get right to it. For those of you who are new to us and at home, the Charles F. Kettering Foundation is a nonpartisan, nonprofit operating foundation founded in 1927 by Charles F. Kettering, who, among other things, invented the electric car starter, so thank you for getting us here. We're headquartered in Dayton, Ohio, and have offices here in Washington, D.C. We focus on advancing inclusive democracy. We are nonpartisan, but we are not neutral when it comes to democracy. We are looking forward to our panels featuring Kettering named and senior fellows Judy Woodruff, Kathleen Sebelius, Christine Todd Whitman, Neal Katyal, and Judge J. Michael Luttig. In addition to the fellows that you will hear from that I just named, other Kettering senior fellows are here too, and I just want to name them. Reverend Dr. William Barber. Now that was a mistake on my part because I should make you wait to clap before going through all of them because it's a long list. Former Director of FBI, James Comey. Retired Ohio Chief Justice, Maureen O'Connor. Former Ohio Democratic Party Chair, David Pepper. Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Vindman. Thank you also to our board members who saw that this is an important enough conversation to be present. Ed Dorn and Roberto Saba. Thank you to all. You all are very compliant, and that's quite gratifying. We are thrilled to be co-sponsored today with our friends at the Rockefeller Foundation. It's been truly a terrific partnership. I'd like to invite Eileen O'Connor, who's Rockefeller's Senior Vice President for Communications, Policy, and Advocacy, up to the podium just to say a few words. Eileen, if you would, welcome.
Thank you so much. And really, thank you for coming, and thank you to those who are watching online and on Zoom. We believe that, just like you said, Brad, that we are a nonpartisan organization, but we believe that democracy should not be a partisan issue, and we are not on the sidelines or nonpartisan when it comes to that. We advocate for democracy both in the United States and around the world because our mission is to improve humanity and improve lives and create opportunity in sustainable ways. And we believe the only way that you can do that is through democratic governments and democratic principles of governing, which is a government that is by the people and for the people. And unfortunately, we believe that in this country and in countries around the world, we've lost that thread. We've lost that connection to those principles. And then that way, it's because we have become more partisan than bipartisan. Good policy is only created, and good government is only created through nonpartisanship. So I'm hoping today that the panels that you see and the people that you'll hear from who have been stalwarts of nonpartisanship and have been really, truly public servants, and those people holding up democratic institutions that are starting to be chipped away. And chipped away because people are frustrated and looking for other alternatives to democracy because they're not seeing democracy work for them. But democracy, true democracy, will and can work for them. And I'm hoping that today, people here and people coming away from this conversation will be inspired to fight for a nonpartisan, good governing democracy in all countries. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Eileen. Hey, Sarah. Kettering has become known for public conversations that pick up a topic and explore it from a number of angles, but with a strong through line for inclusive democracy. And I'm going to invite Kettering President and CEO Sharon L. Davies to come to the stage and begin to draw that through line for us. Sharon is just going to offer us a few thoughts to get us started, and she will bring up our first panel of Judy Woodruff, Kathleen Sebelius, and Christine Todd Whitman. Sharon?
Thank you, Brad, and thank you, Eileen. We are very, very happy to be in partnership with the Rockefeller Foundation in this day's event. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this Kettering Conversation on Democracy. We decided to title this conversation today, Democracy is Not Partisan, for a couple of reasons. Partly to forecast the wonderful lineup of speakers who agreed to be a part of today's event, who fall on different parts of our political spectrum, and partly to refute the suggestion that you sometimes hear today that if you're engaged in the work of defending democracy, you can't be committed to nonpartisan work. We think that's a dangerous suggestion, and we don't agree with it. So we are trying to indicate that through today's title. Those of you who are familiar with the work of the Kettering Foundation know that we are a private, nonprofit, nonpartisan operating foundation, as Brad said, with offices in Dayton, Ohio, and Washington, D.C. The foundation is almost 100 years old. We'll celebrate our 100th year of work in 2027. And over the last 45 nearly years of that time, we have been focused on the health of democracy, both domestically and around the world. When the foundation first began that work, shifting its focus to democracy, it was in the early 1980s. And at that time, democracy was looking pretty positive around the world. It was the trend lines were good. We were confident that democracy would eventually be the system of governance that was chosen around the globe. But as we all know, that has changed pretty dramatically. Freedom House's careful monitoring tells us that democracy has been backsliding for the last 17 years running. Authoritarian leaders are seizing power, and they're sharing notes with each other. So we think it's an important time for us to be in conversation with each other about democracy and its threats. With roughly half of the globe's population this year experiencing elections, 2024 could turn out to be a make-or-break year for democracy. And polling of Americans from both of our two major parties shows that our fellow citizens here in this country are also fearful that our democracy may be in jeopardy, and for good reason. Steve Levitsky, who is also another one of our senior fellows, and his co-author Daniel Ziblatt, in their wonderful book, How Democracies Die, and also Tyranny of the Minority, they've written about the critical conditions that have to exist to keep democracy alive. And specifically, they emphasize the willingness to lose elections, to fight again another day, the rejection of violence as a means for achieving or retaining power, and the willingness to break completely and unambiguously with those who engage in violence or hold anti-democratic extremist views. So with all of this in mind, the Kettering Foundation, beginning a couple of years ago, developed a strategic plan that would enable us to be a part of the fight to preserve democracy in the United States and elsewhere. And a major part of that plan was a commitment to be more public-facing, more visible in this work than we had been in the past, and working collaboratively to help meet the information needs of a democratic society. We're doing that in a variety of ways, and one of the ways is by building an outstanding group of senior fellows and named fellows who are drawn very intentionally from the strengths of both of our major political parties, from government service, from higher education, law, civil society, journalism, and our faith communities. And all of these fellows are actively engaged in the work of democracy. We see them everywhere. You can't turn on your television without seeing one of our senior fellows who is actively engaged in this work around democracy, because we believe it is important work that they are doing, and it is important for us to amplify their voices. At a time when it has become a rare thing to see a Republican and a Democrat sitting side by side in civil conversation, it almost feels like a radical act to provide a platform for them. It's a remarkable thing to say, but it seems a very unusual thing to be able to see these days. So we're doing it quite intentionally. So today's event is designed to push back on the notion that party differences make it impossible for Americans to work together in the defense of democracy. And each of the speakers that you will hear from today have worked and are working to preserve and advance democracy despite political differences and disagreements that they may have with each other. The levels of polarization in our country are deeply concerning to all of us. They're not to be taken lightly. But we also disagree with those who claim that we are hopelessly divided in this country. We have senior fellows, one of whom, Reverend Barber, has recently written an important book called White Poverty. Those of you who know him know that he is the founder of the Moral Mondays movement, and in his new book, he makes a cogent argument that the idea that we are hopelessly divided is a myth. And it's actually a myth in pursuit of something that's quite dangerous to democracy. It's being spread to convince people that there's nothing that we can do to overcome the disagreements that we have together. And that is intended to sow an us against them mentality that is destructive of democracy. So we believe that what you will see today is that reality, that it is a myth that we are hopelessly divided. The truth is that there's never been a time in our nation's history when citizens had to agree on everything to do important work together in the advancement of our democracy. Our speakers will show that beyond all doubt. In a conversation moderated by the incomparable Judy Woodruff, we will bring up first two women elected governors, the first governors in the states for each of them who were women, each winning office despite their party affiliations. So Kathleen Sebelius, a Democrat elected to run the red state of Kansas, and Christine Todd Whitman, a Republican elected to run the blue state of New Jersey. So let's call them up, and please help me in bringing them up to the stage.
Hello, everyone. It's just great to be here. I'm thrilled to be part of this event sponsored by Kettering and the Rockefeller Foundation, and it's just so exciting to see this turnout this morning and some of the special individuals who are here, Secretary of the Smithsonian, Lonnie Bunch, and so many other distinguished people who are with us. So thank you, and I'm honored to have this conversation with, as Sharon Davies just said, you could not have two more perfect people to talk about what we're going to talk about this morning. Kathleen Sebelius, of course, was governor of the state of Kansas before she later became the Secretary of Health and Human Services for the United States. Governor Christie Whitman was governor of the state of New Jersey, arguably a Republican governor in a blue state. Governor Sebelius, a Democratic governor in a red state, and we don't like to label states forever, but I think it's safe to say that right now that's where we are. But let me just lay the groundwork here and start with you, Governor Whitman. Where are we right now in terms of working across the divide? As you look at how things are working in Washington and across the country, you can talk about state capitals. How are we doing at working across the divide?
Well, I wish we were doing better, let me put it that way. I mean, there have been some good signs recently in Congress. There have been a couple things that have happened. Knocking down Marjorie Taylor Greene's effort to throw out the speaker was a good example of bipartisanship. Getting the money through for Ukraine and Israel was another example of bipartisanship that worked. But in general, I don't think our democracy has ever been this threatened, quite frankly. We're hanging on by a thread. But we've got really good people who are working to protect it, and that gives me hope.
Governor Sebelius, or Secretary Sebelius.
Kathleen is fine. I would agree with Christie about the recent congressional action. And actually, you know, if legislation passing and being signed into law is a mark that Congress has moved on some big issues that they've never been able to put together before. And I think that is a good sign. But a lot of the system in Congress is still seems pretty broken. I think states move at a different pace. And at the end of the day, they pass budgets, they pass bills, and they go home. And I think the American people notice the difference. Congress seems hopelessly, you know, unable to come to grips with daily chores, and states continue to move along regardless of the composition of the state. So I think there's a difference in operation. I'm concerned, Judy, as you ask about the platform across the board, that it's not just the elected bodies that I think Americans have some doubt about whether or not they can perform adequately, but you see people beginning to lose faith that the courts are really nonpartisan, unpartisan. Decisions being made are really brought into question. The courts at the highest level has become, you know, an activist court pulling up cases that were not necessarily on the docket so they could make very, I would suggest, controversial decisions. That to me is very dangerous and gives people some loss in faith of an independent judiciary. And I think you see, you know, others in the checks and balances system kind of deferring. So there was an opportunity to, you know, hold the prior administration accountable for the attack on the Capitol. That was deferred. So you've got court delay, you know, institutional deferential system, you've got some gerrymandering going on. So I would agree with Christie, we're at a very precarious point where, you know, if the checks and balances don't operate successfully, then we're in real trouble.
Governor Whitman, yesterday we heard Georgia Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene on the floor of the House in an effort to remove the Speaker, a member of her own party, Speaker Mike Johnson, and her principal argument is that he worked with the other party, that he worked too closely with Democrats. Is that now the operative thinking in Washington from both sides, or are we looking at an extreme?
Unfortunately, it's not that new. I mean, when I can remember going for my courtesy meetings before my appointment at head of EPA, and I was told in the meeting with one of the senators, never use the word consensus. I mean, compromise. Never use the word compromise, because to whoever you said it, they immediately think, I lost something. They don't know what it is, but they think they lost something. And when people have that kind of attitude, that's why I say consensus instead of compromise. Hopefully we can get around that term. But no, that's been an issue for a long time now, unfortunately. I mean, that was back in 2001. And so it's only gotten worse. And part of the problem when people say, well, how did we get here? My response is always look in the mirror. Because for too long, we didn't vote in primaries. Average voter turnout in primaries, 10%. Well, who are those 10%? Most partisan tend to be on the extremes. Then you get to the general election, Congress top of the ticket, 34% turnout is a good turnout. Presidential, we're really still talking about 55% being good, and that is just really, if you think about it, appalling, because more and more people are not liking their choices at the top, and so you have to go back and say, hey, did you ever take civics? Because if you did, you would know that the primaries are important. You need to get out and do that, and we didn't for so long. So that's how we got here, and it's just getting worse, unfortunately.
I'd like to pick up on that just a moment, because voting, I think, is essential in a democracy. And I want to give some more alarming statistics. Only 62% of eligible adults are registered to vote. 62%. So the turnout of 55% is 55% of 62%. We have almost 97 million Americans who are not registered. They're just off the table. In any election, the majority of eligible electors don't vote. Any election. High turnout elections, you're still talking about a percentage of a percentage. That's a dangerous place to be in a democracy, when people don't see the ballot as their way to make a difference, when people don't feel that it makes any use. You know, why should they register? Why should they vote? They don't like the results, so they're out. And I think we have some systemic problems, starting with the Electoral College, where, you know, we have a president who elected in 4 or 5 or 6 states. I mean, I live in Kansas. I know that my vote for president is unlikely to make any difference, because the state is highly likely to support a Republican nominee who I'm unlikely to support. And I think millions of Americans are in that same situation. So we have some voting issues that I think are really problematic.
But there also, the other part of that, to add to that, is you've got 500,000 elective offices across the country, and 70% of those are uncontested in any given year. 70%, and of those 5 to 10% are never filled.
So is the middle just off the playing field? I mean, both because of not being registered to vote, and because so much of our system now has driven our elected leaders farther to the right, farther to the left.
Well, I think, again, there has been a systematic effort since the early 2000s, and I don't mean to sound overly partisan about this, but this is fact, driven by the Republican Party to make it more difficult for people to vote. Going after the Voting Rights Act, putting up registration barriers, making it harder to show up on election day, moving polling places. I mean, a whole series of initiatives which didn't encourage participation, it discouraged participation. And up to and including, you know, the direct participation of people on ballot measures. Let's move the threshold.
Absolutely,
I was
every
saying
time.
Earlier today.
Especially for independents.
If we had, you know, if we talked about this in football terms, let's say, and I do live in the home of the Kansas City Chiefs, so, you know, let's talk about football a little bit. But if you said at the end of the Super Bowl, the 49ers won the game was rigged, we're going to take the trophy home, and we're going to change the rules the next time to make sure that they can't rig it again, people would be outraged. I mean, if we did that to football, I think you'd have a universal outcry by Americans. If you say we're doing that to the democracy, we're just going to, if you can't win with this set of rules, we're going to change the rules, and we're going to make it more difficult for you to get on the field in the first place. I think a lot of people don't see the democracy in the same time. I mean, maybe we need to start talking about football terms and talk about, I'm serious. What are the rules? Do we all agree on the rules? Can we see the game? Did you watch the outcome? Who won, who lost? And we're not going to change the rules the next time because you lost.
And we now see a number of prominent Republicans saying they're not going to accept
just to follow up on that, they are also, the two parties, with all due respect to either party, the two parties have the system exactly the way they want it. And because of redistricting, you have all those districts that are non-competitive. And when I am one of the co-founders with Andrew Yang, if you want to talk about bipartisanship, of the Forward Party. And when you try to get on the ballot in states, what they do to get on as an independent versus what you'd have to do to get on as a Republican or a Democrat is sometimes 50-fold harder. 50% more signatures to get on the ballot in some states as an independent than it is for a Republican or a Democrat. And that's the extreme, but there are a lot of those, and you see that changing. The minute they feel that there really may be a legitimate third-party effort, it's amazing how those rules change and make it more difficult every time for there to be a third-party candidate.
Unless you're in Michigan, and then 2 people can
Right.
put you on the ballot.
Right. Or in Pennsylvania, if you have a statewide candidate who gets 2% of the vote, then you become a minor party for 10 years.
Secretary Sebelius, when you were governor, how did you work? I mean, give us some examples of how you worked with the other party in Kansas to get things done.
Well, I always had a majority Republican legislature, so I never enjoyed a majority of my own party. So I knew to get anything done, I needed Republicans. I mean, it wasn't a luxury to say if I had all the Democrats, we could pass things. That just, the numbers didn't work. So I think that mindset helped from the beginning. But at least in Kansas, there were always sort of 3 parties. There was the Democratic Party, pretty united, broad coalition, didn't agree on everything. There was I would say, a more moderate, Bob Dole, Nancy Kassebaum Republican Party. And Kansas was one of the first parties to actually begin to split well before the National Party split at the Republican basis. We saw this very right-wing group of new legislators being elected who did not support anything the government did. That was the real difference. They did not support public education funding. They did not support, public health. They didn't. It wasn't a debate about how much the government should do versus the private sector. Government should do nothing. And I think you see that mindset in Congress. Shutting down the government is not an issue if you don't want government to do anything, right? If you really believe that that's the best place to be, then shutting the government down doesn't matter. So I always had a group of Republicans who, wanted school finance. And I inherited a 6-year-old constitutional battle on school finance. And the lawyers decided not to accelerate the case until I was elected because the previous governor made it clear he didn't want to really engage in that. So we had the court on one side, we had a legislature on the other side, and we had to pass a constitutional school finance funding bill. And it took a while. It took a special session, me vetoing a few things. But at the end of the day, we did. And we put together a formula that I think was fair and more funding for schools, but also more equitable for kids across the state.
So it was a matter of picking who you could work with on the other side and sitting down with them. And did it involve persuasion, or did they just come to the table ready to?
Oh, they did not come to the table. Persuasion, a few little threats, negotiation. President Obama used to say, for people who were on the other side, if they'll help me with health care, I'll mow their lawn, I'll pick up their dry cleaning, you just tell me. But I think that's part of it, Judy, is personal. Yeah. I could establish, it was about relationships and about trust. I had been in the legislature. I knew a bunch of these folks. I also knew what they needed to deliver back home. And one of the things we did is what I would call an inside-outside game. They were very good at being in Topeka and voting one way and then going home and telling their constituents, oh, I support education, I support this. So I went on a tour picking out very specific districts, and I would go report on how they were doing with very specific examples. And I'd be there with the Chamber of Commerce and with the school superintendent and with and say, you know, Reverend Barber talks about being interested in lifting people out of poverty, but, you know, he's eating $400 meals and being hosted and toasted by lobbyists. I'm using Reverend Barber because I know that is the furthest thing he would ever do. But I mean, I just wanted to make that very, very clear. But I mean, so it's that kind of, it's being able to talk to people directly, it's being able to hold folks accountable so that they're not invisible when they get in the Capitol, and putting together a vote at a time, the votes that we needed.
What's the most serious threat you ever employed? Can you share that?
Sure. Usually it was about their own reelection. You know, I would bring with me my vote tally from their district, and I would bring with me the names of 3 candidates who I knew could beat these folks, and say, I can be involved or not. You know, we'll see. But this is really important, and a lot of people listen, because it turns out they wanted their jobs more than they believed that they could, you know, fight. So you have to, I think you have to be willing. Mm-hmm. I can't imagine the fights you had in New Jersey, but Kansas, we're mild. I mean, she's in New Jersey.
Governor Whitman, how did it work for you? You were dealing with a legislature that was
Republican. So let me assure you, having all of your own party is not is not what you think it is. Let me put it that way. And I did most of my deals on the most controversial issues with the Democrats, frankly. I had a Republican House and a Republican Senate, and they were quite conservative. Not as bad as we get it today, but still, they were a little bit more to the right than I was. And so I did things with them. Obviously, you had to, because they controlled, if you had the Speaker of the House who would, what bills got up, what bills didn't, you had to work with them very closely, but that was almost as bad as you're having to work with Republicans in Kansas. But for the Democrats, when I would do things like when we had welfare reform, and I had to work it through, I had to get both parties, because it was never going to be, I wasn't going to have enough, because I wanted to be, it was when Bill Clinton, President Clinton, had opened up the process, so that sent it to the states, so that you had some room to make decisions relative to welfare reform. And I wanted to make it so that, obviously, you said, look, if you're going to be getting this, you had to, particularly for single moms, you had to either be working or get some training for work. But I recognize you're a single mom, which means you have a kid, and we've got to take care of that. We can't just ask people to go off and get a job or get training and expect them to leave the children at home or anything. So we put in health care for children, which also brought kid care, which brought the parents to doctors, which helped with their health. We agreed to pay for family members who would look after the child or to help them get home, somebody to stay with the child when they were too young to be in school. And a lot of the Republicans just hated that part of it. They wanted to be tough. They wanted to, everybody had to work irrespective of anything, or they had to be in training. And so it was working with the Democrats. Obviously, they were in the minority, so I had to have Republican votes as well. And it was picking out those Republicans who were a little bit more progressive and understanding, as well as the Democrats who were willing to work with a Republican. And it wasn't the same kind of problem you have today. It wasn't nearly as strictly party line. They did have some flexibility. And of course, it depended on their district as well, where they came from and how sympathetic they were to it. So you found the ones who were in districts that had the higher population of welfare moms. And those are the ones that you worked with on that particular bill. Auto insurance, too, which was a big issue in the state of New Jersey, worked more with the Democrats than with the Republicans, although you had to have both. I had to have both in order to get anything
You were
done.
dealing with both.
And I had
the
to
more
deal with
conservative
both.
Republicans.
I had to do both.
Yeah,
too,
I mean, you
so,
had to
yeah.
have both of them because you didn't have enough on either one side. And so it was interesting, I'll put it that way. It made a challenge. You did kind of put some pressure on them at times, but I didn't do a lot of that. I didn't have to go to the districts and say, I might play in this or I might not. Frankly, I wasn't sure whether that was going to be good or bad, depending on the district, with the Democrats and the Republicans. But I must say, it was the Republicans who almost cost me my reelect, because that was the year that Bill Clinton, 1997, had sent abortion bills, abortion back to the states. And he vetoed the partial birth abortion bill. And my Republican said, we got to have one. And I said, okay, if you feel you got to do this, but really, and then because they were all up too. The legislature runs the same year as the governor, both houses. Everybody was up. And so the Republicans started writing this bill, and I kept saying, I cannot sign this bill. Not because I'm pro-choice, not just because I'm pro-choice, but because the New Jersey state constitution requires an exception for life and health of the mother, and they weren't putting that in because that's what the really hard pro-life people didn't want to see that in. And I don't think they thought I was going to actually conditionally veto it. At that point, I was the only governor that had what was known as a conditional veto, which meant that on any piece of legislation, as long as I stayed within the parameters of the intent of the bill, I could rewrite it, and it took a 2/3 vote to override.
Wow.
And I didn't
I'd
use
like
it
that.
much. But every governor, believe me, they all envied me that one, as well as some of the other powers that New Jersey governors had, but and have. But I did. I rewrote it, and I did put in for the first time some restrictions on late-term abortions. You know, saying young people under 16 or had to find someone. It didn't have to be a church. It could be a church. It could be a doctor. It could be a mentor. It could be, you know, we made it as broad as possible. And I sent it back to them. It was the only time they overrode me and overrode a veto. That was the only veto I had overridden. And it brought a third person into the race who was a pro-lifer. And as I said, if I'd gotten half of what that person had gotten, which I would have easily, in New Jersey, it would have been a landslide. As it was, I squeaked through, but they still called me governor at the end of the day.
Are there, I mean, it sounds heroic, I mean, in today's measurements, if you will, but are there things that you found that worked, and we've got a friend up here visiting.
Yeah.
Are there things that worked for you, Secretary Sebelius, that would work today, or are we in such a different time that everything is just a different world?
Well, I agree with a lot of what Sharon laid out as the premise that Kettering is working on. I don't find today's world hopeless. I live in a state of Kansas, which has a Democratic governor and a Republican majority. We have our third Democratic woman governor in Kansas right now. She is facing a supermajority in the legislature, which I never did, and that makes it more difficult. But there's a real effort underway to break that supermajority, and it's kind of shared by both parties. There are some very moderate folks who are very helpful in that, and we have some very specific districts targeted. So that work can be done. I mean, the supermajority has done some blockage. So I've watched that come across, you know, the aisle, people move back and forth. I do think, to Christie's earlier points, that relationships really matter. Figuring out who, and you know, I was on the National Common Cause Board for a number of years, and there was I think Fred Wertheimer was famous saying, no permanent friends, no permanent enemies. And I think that notion is really important because depending on the issue, I would have the ability to put together allies. I can watch that happen, and they may not be on the next issue.
Right.
You know, school finance brought a group of people who cared about schools but might not care. Privacy, the most conservative Republicans would join in a debate about how to protect privacy. And you know, so it went back and forth. And I think our current governor, again, elected by a majority of the votes and has a more difficult legislature, but she can continue to get things done. What I hear people talking about in Washington, which I think is almost more frightening than some of the antics, is the extreme dislike members have for one another, the personal attacks people have for each other. That's, I think, more corrosive in some ways than the numbers. Because if you can't form those relationships, if you can't trust your colleague, if you can't rely on some basic agreement on what the facts are, then I think you're in real troubled. This doesn't work because it's really about, I think, personal connections and at least a shared set of facts. I mean, these are the rules. We'll play by the rules. You win sometimes, I win sometimes, and we'll move on. But that does not seem to be the attitude of folks right now, particularly in DC.
What about for you, Governor? Did anything you saw or worked with then apply today?
Well, again, I agree with Kathleen that personal relationships still apply. What gives me hope is organizations like the States United Democracy Center that I co-chair a part of, and that's nonpartisan, non-political, but it's about defending democracy, fighting back against these efforts to undermine the ability to vote, the kinds of things you were talking about of moving polling places and things like that. We bring lawsuits, we go after that and try to do everything we can in helping states attorneys general, secretaries of states, governors push back. And the number of people that are using that are actually looking for what the kind of work we're doing to help them push back is encouraging. And then with the Forward Party, because we're starting at the grassroots level, the number of people that are so anxious for another choice tells me that really there are a lot of people who get it, who get how dangerous our situation is right now and really want to see a change. Because the world is really very different. It was not this bitterly partisan when I was governor. I mean, it was partisan, believe me, but it wasn't this kind of bitterness, this I hate you. If you're not with me,
nature,
I hate you. The personal nature of it is a huge roadblock to getting anything done. When you say that someone who disagrees with me doesn't just disagree, that makes them evil, makes them wrong. It's not just wrong, it makes them evil. And that's the hurdle you have to get over. When I see these people who are coming to us at Forward, the people who are the people in office that are the ones who will protect the vote, no matter who wins after this election, those are the people that give me hope that we can get beyond this if we all really, truly understand the nature of what we're facing and the importance of it.
I would say too, I mean, Christy talked about her difficulties with reproductive rights issues. I certainly had them in Kansas. But the momentum of this sort of organic citizens movement to push back against freedom being taken away is really encouraging. We saw a slightly discouraging piece of the puzzle where, you know, Kansas had the first vote post-Dobbs, 6 weeks after Dobbs, blew away every single previous threshold of who votes in a primary, who turns out, you know, in an overwhelming rejection of the decision. But 3 months later, in the general election, there were thousands of people who did not vote, who voted in August and didn't vote in November, and which said to me they were compelled by an issue, something that they felt they could control, something that they could determine the outcome, and did not feel as compelled when it was the governor's race and legislative races. I mean, they just didn't come back.
But you're up against, I mean, to play devil's advocate here, and realistic, you are up against two powerful political parties, the institutions they represent, the money they represent, the way the primary system is organized, the way districts are drawn, the list goes on and on. Members of Congress are rewarded for sticking with the party. You are punished if you work with the other side. And as you said, Governor Whitman, it's not a new thing. It's been around for a while, but it seems to me it's even more entrenched today. So how do we begin to make it okay to work with the other side, to find, I mean, you and I, the three of us were talking before we came up here about what happened with immigration, the immigration compromise, and other issues. How do you begin to turn that?
Well, that's what we're doing at Forward, frankly, is starting at that state and local level. And the Forward Party is different from any conventional party in the sense that they're at the federal level. We don't have a platform that says you have to be pro-choice or pro-gun. What we have is a platform that if you want to be a Forward candidate, and we support Republicans, Democrats, Independents, where we're not on the ballot, but we're on the ballot in 5 states, you have to sign this pledge that says, I will uphold the rule of law, I will support the Constitution. I will work with anyone to solve problems and create a safe environment for the discussion of controversial issues, work constantly to open the process and ensure that anyone who is eligible to vote gets to vote, and make it easier for that process. And then it's going to be up to the states and the candidates to determine what are the issues of importance to their constituents, rather than have a federal party tell them what to do. And what we're seeing is that people who are coming to us are people, and we have Republicans and Democrats and independents, who are saying, I agree with my party, I'm still a Democrat, but a state senator in Pennsylvania, for instance, is a Democrat from Philadelphia, and he believes in school choice. But the Democratic Party there wants nothing to do with school choice. And he said, okay, fine. I am now going to be a forward Democrat, which will allow me, I will still caucus with you, but know that I am going to be my own person. And this is what my constituents want, and that's who I represent. And if you give people an opportunity to see that their vote will matter, the other thing it will do, we're looking at the reverse coattails impact of, if you don't want to vote this year because the presidential choices are just something that you don't want to deal with, but if you see a school board member, or you see a local mayor or council person, or you see an attorney general or a secretary of state candidate that you think is in the center, you'll come and vote for them. And if you do that, then what history has shown us is that you'll stay on the ballot and continue to look for similar candidates as you go up. And that will hopefully bring more people to the poll who are centrists, who will pick Republicans or Democrats or independents, who are people who are in the center, willing to work to solve the problems of their constituents rather than just what the party tells them. And this has been going on for so long, because in '97, after I won re-election, I was asked to run for the Senate. I didn't want to, but I said, okay, I'll come down and talk about it. Met with the senatorial campaign committee then and was told if I said one word about campaign finance reform, that was it, no support from them. And that's the kind of strength that the
How many
parties
states
have.
are you on the ballot with the forward?
5. We're on Utah, Texas, Utah, Florida, North Carolina, Texas, and Connecticut.
And do you expect to be on how many more?
Probably not this year any more than that, but we have candidates in almost every state.
I'm going to come back to the question. You're up against this massive, powerful political system. 2 parties that come at it with all the money, all the influence. How do you change this?
Well, I have a slightly different approach. I'm not sure having a third party is the solution. I respect the work that the governor's doing. I guess I think that a lot of what is being described is part of a broad coalition within an umbrella of a party. I think there are, certainly Democrats who span a great ideological spectrum, and the notion that Democrats actually voted yesterday to save Steve Johnson as Speaker Mike Johnson, I'm sorry, whatever his name is, Mr. Johnson from, is almost unfathomable given his political beliefs. But I think what you saw is people who said, we want a system to be able to work. We want to be able to govern. We want to be able to do our jobs. And that, caused a vote that leapt over a lot of party line principles, a lot of philosophical differences. That goes on less frequently in Congress. That at least is the practical operation that goes on in states, I think, on a much more regular basis. I was kind of chuckling about primaries. There was a long time in Kansas where if you had one live Democrat who would sign up for any seat, you were thrilled. I mean, Democrats didn't vote in primaries. We didn't have 2 people who were contesting anything. It's like, are you alive? Are you breathing? Are you registered? Would you be a candidate? That has changed somewhat. We actually have primaries, and people are starting to vote in primaries. But I think having a litmus test is very dangerous. Having to, you know, you can only be a Republican if you believe these three things. You can only be a Democrat if you believe these three things. That, I think, gets into a dangerous territory, and that is happening in some areas on a regular basis. And I think those of us who believe that you need to govern with people in a broad ideological spectrum need to actually resist that at the party level.
And I hear you, and at the same time, are there steps that can be taken structurally? Primary reform. We know there's some of that underway. I was just in Alaska a few weeks ago, looking at what they've done. There's now an effort to repeal that.
I know.
But are there steps that...
I mean,
Absolutely.
redistricting done by a commission that has nothing to do with parties would be a huge step.
But ranked choice voting, I think.
Ranked choice voting, I
Open
would-
primaries, first 5 across the line, fusion voting, those are all ways. And again, that's the kind of thing that we support at Forward, but we don't tell them it has to be one or the other, because the states need to pick out what's going to pass. I mean, if you're never going to get ranked choice voting, but you could get fusion voting, that's a start. That's beginning to open it. But I think you need to open the process. And that's very important. Redistricting money. In many of the states, you can do things on a state level about money in politics. For instance, we have, I don't know whether you had in Kansas, Kathleen, we have public funding for gubernatorial. Now, you don't have to take it, but if you take it, the thing, and I'd been against it, but then I thought, no, this makes sense because it limits how much you can spend.
You can buy, yeah.
And that really takes a lot of that dark money out of the process. And so I've become a
But at the
big
federal
supporter.
level, it's still
You can't.
a huge...
But
Yeah, it's
redrawing
huge.
district lines
Yes, I agree.
federally or at the state
Right.
level by an independent body, and that
Could make a
more
difference.
I think could make a huge difference.
I believe that too.
Huge difference. Then you don't have incumbents protecting their own turf. I mean, that's one of the issues I think that you see trickle down. If everybody draws lines, that starts with them. You know, I will put myself in this district because of this. It doesn't matter if constituents feel, you know, that they're disenfranchised. It doesn't matter, you know, what the makeup. As long as I can be reelected, that becomes job number
And that's
one.
where term limits, I think, come in too.
And
I'm
term
a strong believer in term
What
limits.
about the messages coming from our leaders, from our political leaders?
Yeah,
Boy,
I agree.
how much difference could that make, can it make right now?
Words shape behavior, so it could make a huge difference. I mean, I don't hate Donald Trump. I deplore what he's done to our country. And it's his words that have made people feel that it's okay to act out on things and emotions that have always been there. I mean, unfortunately, we have to acknowledge that, but it was never okay to be open about racism and about anti-Semitism, and it wasn't okay to go in and if you lose, you don't just get mad, you take a gun out. I mean, it's because of that it's so changed the country that make people concerned and afraid, and a lot of good people won't run for office because they're afraid. They say, why should I put my family through this? Or they're personally, physically afraid. And that's something we just haven't seen.
I think you also, I mean, I've talked to young people who are teachers or in the mental health profession, and they are really alarmed at what's going on with kids who are mimicking the
Right.
kind of language, you know, the
Yeah.
notion that you call people losers or suckers, or you mock their physical appearance, or you mock their parents. And the response that this young teacher talked to me about is, well, the president says that, so I can say it.
Right.
I mean, and they're talking about Donald Trump. And when you think about that, I mean, that bully pulpit and that ability to be mimicked and is very, very powerful. And that's been going on now, you know, for years. And it's now regarded as sort of okay. We almost become immune to language like that by one of the highest leaders in the land. And I think it has a huge impact on people's behavior, on what they feel comfortable saying to one another. And when your kids begin to mimic it, it's really terrifying.
And I have a question about the not much example of working across the aisle in Washington, but that seeped down to the state level. I mean, you've been talking about that. We were just doing some reporting in Tennessee, looking at efforts by some folks in Tennessee. They actually invited in an outside group called Starts With Us to try to bring together Tennessee, and this is after a terrible school shooting at a middle school in Tennessee, Nashville. They brought together 11 Tennesseans from across the spectrum, all the way from very much pro-gun rights to very much pro-gun control. They put them together for 3 days. They all agreed to have these conversations. They ranged from a man who owned a shooting range, lived in a rural part of Tennessee, very much Second Amendment guy. He said, I'm an absolutist when it comes to the Second Amendment. But after this experience of sitting with people for a few days, he said, I understand when I hear the word, people talk about a gun, I think about protecting myself. When they hear about the word gun or shooting, they think about, they're worried about someone's safety. One woman, a teacher, had lost 2 students in her school she was very close to. So, but long story short, they came up with 5 recommendations. The Tennessee legislature would not even be briefed, would not listen to what they had to offer. And so when the lack of listening and conversation is at that level, again, my question is, how do you break through that?
Well, we have a similar situation, not with guns, although that's certainly an issue in Kansas, but I mean, we're one of the states that has not expanded Medicaid. The population is very much in favor of it. Rural hospitals have closed. The legislature will not. I mean, the legislative leaders specifically block it from coming to the floor. If it came to the floor, it would pass. We do not have initiative and referendum in Kansas. We're one of the only states west of the Mississippi where you can't get something on the ballot unless you go through the legislature. So we watch that every day, and it's going to take some time. We may be the 49th state to expand, but it's going to happen. And there is a lack of accountability often within our legislative body. I think after the big vote on the constitutional amendment guaranteeing privacy, the legislature went right back and passed 4 more horrific abortion bills trying to limit women's rights. They passed one this year, the 11 questions you have to ask a woman before she is allowed to have them. Like, why are you doing this? Have you informed your spouse? I mean, it's really stunning, and overrode governor's vetoes in all of them. So the voters say one thing, the legislature does another, and I think the solution in this case is not only more talking and listening, but going and firing the people who are blocking that democratic process, and that's one of the things I'm going to be involved in this fall. And just to, again, report to the voters, this is the way your legislator voted on these 3 issues. Here's the way this district feels about these 3 issues, and there's a candidate who feels differently, and kind of connect the dots. Because I think people often are very confused and don't really know, and that kind of, that's part of listening. Right. We're going to listen to you. You need somebody to listen to you, and
that's where it has to start. We have to start electing people at the local level who are the ones who will stand up for the rule of law, for the Constitution, for these principles. And the good news is you don't have to have the majority. You only have to have the critical nucleus. And if people think that they have to have everybody, you just say to them, look at the difference that Joe Manchin made in the last Congress. One man. A lot of legislation revolved around that one man. So if you get in a legislature, it may only take 5 or 10. If you look at Congress now, it is so evenly divided. It would be about 10 people in the center who could really, really make a difference. You'd have to go through them. And that's the way we start to change it. But as Kathleen said, it's going to take time. You've got to be in it for the long haul. You can't just assume you can do it overnight. It's not going to happen that way. And We unfortunately are a society that wants to have things done like that. If we can't do it right away, then we move on to something else. This is where civics needs to be taught again in the schools. That would be a nice thing, and that we really pay attention to the importance of these local offices.
Some final words of hope from Governor Whitman and Governor Sebelius. Thank you both. Thank you very much.
And you are set. Oh, no, you're the administrator.
I am honored to be sitting here to the right, your left, of Sarah Longwell, and to be on stage with her. I don't know if she knew what she was in for when JetBlue put us together on a flight home from Nantucket. Do you remember that?
I do.
It was a day of infamy, and I, like an opportunist and a crass person, I capitalized on it immediately and asked if she would be on one of our conversations.
You know, I actually flew out on that flight with Judy Woodruff, and they lost her luggage.
They did, didn't
Yeah.
they? It's sort of a Bermuda Triangle up there. It's, you know, it's terrible. But I'm sure everyone here knows Sarah, but if you don't yet, longtime Republican political strategist focusing on defending American democracy, founded Defending Democracy together with Bill Kristol in 2018, publisher and co-founder of The Bulwark, which we all read, host of the podcast The Focus Group, which we all listen to, or if you don't, you should. Held hundreds and hundreds of focus groups with voters all around the country. Sarah, thank you for saying yes and for being here.
Thanks for having me. Oh, thanks. Thank you, Jim Comey.
Everybody's like fan-humaning about that you're up here, and they're jealous of me, but I'm going to start with a question. Presidential elections used to be a contest between two major parties. We were a 50-50 nation, and we were arguing for the independent, so-called independent voters in the middle. Is that still true? What has happened?
Yeah, I mean, it's less about independence. Like, our politics is really scrambled now. And when I think about the coalition you're trying to put together in the current political environment, it's less about fighting for traditional independence, and it's more about thinking about how do you build the biggest, broadest pro-democracy coalition that spans from sort of Liz Warren to Liz Cheney. And there are a lot of voters in there that are sort of right-leaning independents, soft GOP voters, and it's like there's a political realignment going on. So a lot of the voters that I focus on, and to be clear, I think actually probably lots of you don't know who I am, which is fine. You don't have to watch lots of cable news or listen to podcasts. But I started doing focus groups because I had been a Republican my entire life, but when Donald Trump happened, I was trying to figure out, how do we primary him? How do we, you know, sort of eliminate this force in our politics? He was going to destroy the Republican Party and destroy the country. And so I started thinking about, I started talking to voters. I didn't understand how it had happened that America had elected Donald Trump. I started conducting all of these focus groups, and I realized very quickly, actually, that a lot of people did want Donald Trump, and that a lot of voters who were actually, you know, we're talking about people who don't vote, how many people don't vote. A lot of people who'd never voted before were now engaged in the political system, and they wanted somebody like Donald Trump. But a lot of the Republican voters who voted for John McCain, who voted for Mitt Romney, and who I identified with, a lot of those voters were unwilling to vote for Donald Trump. And so there has been this ongoing shift in our politics where a lot of these college-educated suburban voters, not just women, are sort of realigning themselves out of the Republican Party, and a bunch of new voters, and a lot of sort of white working class voters, but not exclusively white working class voters. Now there's a lot of Hispanics, a lot of black voters who are sort of realigning into it is the Republican Party, but it's not the same Republican Party I joined by a long shot. I think that's clear to all of us. They are coming for Trump. And Trump and the Republican Party that I came up in actually have very little in common, except that he's co-opted so many people who were part of the original party.
So what does that realignment end up looking like? Like, look down the road just a minute or two.
I mean, I think we're in the middle of it, and I think it's going to keep going. I don't think we're at some end point, but I do think we're in the middle of, because of just a whole bunch of disruptive factors, social media, the fracturing of traditional media, geographic segmentation, entrenched polarization. There is a bunch of reasons that I think we have to, like, we're in a populist moment, and one thing that I say when I don't have a lot of time, like this is a short conversation, and I'm always like, if there's one thing that you remember that I said to you, because it's going to save you time, is that the Republican Party of Mitt Romney and the one that you knew, it's not coming back. It is not coming back. Like, something new will take the place of this Republican Party, and I don't know where it's going, obviously, but I think that you are much more likely for the person who comes after Trump to be on a spectrum of Tucker Carlson to J.D. Vance than Mitt Romney to Liz Cheney. Like, that's not where we're headed.
So you've been talking to thousands and thousands and thousands of voters. What are the pro-democracy messages that are landing?
So here's what's interesting about I think about democracy all the time. I think about voters and democracy. And I'm going to say two things that are going to sound contradictory, but they're not. One is voters don't care about democracy. They never talk about it. They never bring it up. They are not focused on it. And yet, it is deeply embedded inside of them, right? And when you ask voters about democracy, well, one of the negatives is that democracy, the word democracy, is becoming polarized like everything else, right? Like, Republicans think that Democrats are a threat to democracy because they stole the 2020 election. Democrats think Republicans are a threat to democracy because they said that the election was stolen and then stormed the Capitol. And so democracy itself is becoming polarized like everything else when you ask people about it. But, like, there's still a lot of infrastructure in people where when you ask, I've been doing a lot of, about 70% of the Republican Party believes that the election was stolen. But we've been doing a lot to talk to the 30% who believes that it's not. And one of the things that's interesting about that 30% is they are incredibly optimistic and have a ton of faith in America and its systems. They were like, yeah, well, I know it wasn't stolen because they counted it a bunch of times, and I trust the system, and the system works. And I think that when I say it's deeply embedded, people think of democracy as that thing we do here in America. And so I've always thought that the answer to the situation that we're in, this isn't the question you asked me, but I'm going to tell you anyway, that the solution to the moment we're in is two things. One is around leadership. I think in all of the things that you heard people talk about on the last panel, there's a lot of good stuff in there. But a lot of that is about changing some of the systems, changing primaries and ranked choice voting. And, like, we need better candidates, and we need people to run who are great leaders. And actually, we've got some good leaders on the horizon. Josh Shapiro, Gretchen Whitmer, Warnock, Wes Moore. We have a bunch of good civil servants that are out there that I think are ready. I think we don't have to feel as bleak about the way things are. I think we can feel pretty bleak about the Republican Party, but sometimes I'm not as interested in some of the third party things because I think that the Democratic Party has an opportunity to be the big, broad pro-democracy coalition right now and bring in so many of these disaffected Republicans and create the incentives needed to change. Like, the Republican Party is only going to change because the incentives are created through sustained electoral defeat. And so you build that broad coalition, you got to bring people in. And I think there's a lot of Democratic politicians that are right there ready to sort of take on that mantle and can do that work. And so that, I think, creates optimism. I know I said two things, but I don't remember the first one now because I went on such a tangent.
I don't even remember either.
Yeah.
I didn't remember there were two. But I'm going to make up an abbreviation based on what you just said. GOTV is get out the vote. You're positing GOTL, get out the leaders, is what we need. Is it that simple, really?
Yeah, no, it's not, because I remember the second point.
Oh, good.
Which is that, when I said that people think democracy is that thing we do here, right? That's about America. And one of the things that Donald Trump has done that is so pernicious, and honestly, it's crazy, because one of the reasons that I was a Republican and that I came up in the conservative movement is I felt like the left didn't like America that much. Like, all they wanted to talk about was everything that was wrong with America. And I was like, no, America's the best. And I have almost, naive's not the right, I have a very earnest love of America. It might be because I have a mom who came over here on a boat and she kind of had like an immigrant zeal. The founding father stuff was all over the mantle and everything. But I think helping, like if we're going to we want people to fight for democracy. We want people to care about democracy. And that means telling them, like telling a better story about democracy means telling a better story about America, right? What are we doing here? Democracy is just a set of tools. I'll just say one quick thing, which is in 2005, I worked at this conservative think tank called the Intercollegiate Studies Institute in Delaware. It's actually right across from Joe Biden's house. And my boss was a woman named Christine O'Donnell. And since if we're talking about throwback politics, you might remember her because she was not a witch. Do you remember that?
I do.
Yeah, she was not a witch, but she beat, in an early kind of Tea Party zeal, she beat the moderate Mike Castle in Delaware, and so then she ran against the current sitting senator, Chris Coons. And Christine O'Donnell gets fired because she's a crazy person. And I got her job.
But not a witch.
Yeah, not a witch, but wild. And so I got her job running communications there at a very young age. And my job was to go around with Rick Santorum. So he had just published a book called It Takes a Family. And it was like an answer to Hillary Clinton's It Takes a Village. He wanted to be president, but he was very anti-gay. Like he was talking about, his like speeches were all about bestiality and homosexuality and where we were headed. And I was like trying to come out to my parents. And I was like, this sucks. And so it's like 2005, because gay marriage is a big issue. They've just passed it in Massachusetts. Everywhere we went, gay protesters were like glitter bombing him. Remember glitter bombing as a tactic? People just throwing purple glitter at people. But anyway, I went to an event, and there was this kid there, this young girl. She was there with her two moms, and she had this sign that said, "My two moms take me bowling." And I was like, I quit. I'm going to go do something else. But in the interim, from 2005, when that happened, to 2013, which is when I got married, we went from that Rick Santorum moment to passing gay marriage. That is what democracy did. A bunch of people made an argument. They tried to persuade their fellow Americans, and Americans changed their mind. And so I think that we have to focus on persuading people. Like it just got said in the last panel that people are losing faith in democracy. Well, we better start telling a better story about democracy. We better start telling a better story about America. We got to, the 250th anniversary of America is coming up, so we got a good opportunity, I think, to make a new pitch for what it is we're doing here, which is the most special thing that's ever been done in the world. And I think that it's incumbent on all of us who are in this democracy space to encourage our leaders, right, to like, that's the thing, Donald, when we were talking about the reasons that Donald Trump is such a pernicious force. He says America's bad all the time, right? He's American carnage. That's what we're in the middle of. That's not right. Like, that's wrong. It's the wrong characterization of America, and I think we need to do the job of helping people understand that democracy is a set of tools through which we fight every day to make things more perfect.
So I'm going to ask you a question that
stop
I asked.
Stop me.
I asked it before and you didn't answer it, and
Sure.
And now you just said we need better messaging for democracy. What are the messages that land?
Well, I mean, I do think I answered it. I think it is this. People want to feel good about the country they live in, right? I talk a lot about permission structures because I'm in the communications business, and permission structures are about helping somebody come to something they kind of want to do anyway, right? So people want to feel good about America, and I think our leaders, right now, we have sort of awash in what I'd call conflict entrepreneurs. They feed off the idea that we need to hate each other, and they understand that of the 5 dominant human emotions, fear, love, anger, greed, and sympathy, flags, that fear and anger are the 2 that drive people to action. And so they lean in on the fear and anger. And somebody has to disrupt that. That's what I mean by leadership. And one of the ways you disrupt that is telling people a positive story about what we're doing here, right? Why pluralism is so important, why free speech is so important, why America's a miraculous place. I sit in rooms all the time with people who talk about democracy, who talk about how we are not special, and how, and it's all the ways that we're failing. And I agree, like in this moment, we're in a tough moment. But the way that we get out of it, I think, is to make an earnest pitch for that thing that we are doing here, because I do think that democracy infrastructure is in people. It's not, Like the people I think sometimes obsess over like this message or that message, but you know what it means to tell a better story about America, right? To have somebody make that positive and affirmative pitch as opposed to what's being done right now.
45 seconds, what's the most encouraging thing you've heard in the last month?
Oh, geez. Well, actually, so I don't know if you're talking about politics. If you look at what's happening, like just happened in Indiana, the percentage of the vote that Donald Trump is losing in primaries to Nikki Haley, who is not in the race and has not been for months, is significant. And for this election, you're not building a pro-Joe Biden coalition. I'm sorry. You are building an anti-Trump coalition. That is the biggest coalition that exists right now. And the fact that there is a self-motivated 20-ish% in most of these states of Republicans who are turning out for no reason other than to cast a vote against Donald Trump makes me feel like something is not computing in the polls, but there is an enthusiasm for people who want to get out there and say, I will reject this, I'm going to reject this.
Please join me in being a fanboy for Sarah Longwell. Welcome back. I hope you all have been enjoying lunch. You clearly are still enjoying lunch. Our next conversation we are calling The Importance of Institutions. As we were designing the day, we kept coming back to these fundamental principles of rule of law and how critically it undergirds our democracy and really enables it. And I can't think of a better group to take up this topic than the one you are about to hear now. Kettering Senior Fellow Neal Katyal, former acting Solicitor General of the United States, who has argued over 50 cases before the Supreme Court, more cases than any minority attorney, having beaten Thurgood Marshall's record. As if that were not enough, he has also appeared in House of Cards and Billions as himself. I want to do that. Another Kettering Senior Fellow, Judge J. Michael Luttig. He's one of the most important legal scholars today, a renowned conservative jurist, clerked for Judge Antonin Scalia, served in the Reagan White House, Assistant Attorney General, served on the U.S. Court of Appeals Fourth Circuit bench for 15 years, and was on the short list for nomination to the U.S. Supreme Court. These two will be led in conversation by the amazing Melissa Murray, professor at NYU Law, co-author of the best-selling new book, The Trump Indictments. Please read it. Former law clerk to then U.S. Court of Appeals Judge Sonia Sotomayor, co-host of the hugely popular Supreme Court podcast, Who Thought There Would Be One?, Strict Scrutiny, and a legal analyst for MSNBC. I can't wait to hear from these three. Please come on up and get ready to enjoy yourselves.
Thank you so much for having us. We know we're right in the middle of dessert, so we'll try and make this as amusing and amuse-bouche as possible. I will also say, the first panel was such a delight for me as a constitutional law professor, because I know you know these speakers as Governor Sebelius and Governor Whitman, but I know them as the other side of NFIB versus Sebelius and American Trucking Association versus Whitman. So very exciting to see them in the flesh today. My students are going to be so jealous. So the topic of conversation is the importance of institutions, and we've heard a lot of discussion about the term democracy today. And so, like any good law professor, I want to go back to the beginning. Right, so the origins of the term democracy come from ancient Greece, the classical period, and Athens was the birthplace of democracy. But notably, what made Athens so distinctive was that it was a relatively homogeneous society. The Athenians looked alike, they had a common set of institutions, they had a common set of values, and that kind of homogeneity allowed democracy to really flourish. That is very different from what we are trying to do here in the United States today. And so I guess the first question I'll ask you first, Neal, can a multi-faith, multiracial, pluralistic society sustain democracy?
So the answer to that, I think, is yes. But before getting to the answer, I just want to thank you and Kettering for the opportunity to be here. And it's so rare I get to appear with Judge Luttig, but I just have to say what an honor it is. Judge, when I was in law school in 1994, I did not apply to clerk for you. I was scared of you. When I clerked for Justice Breyer, the clerks you sent up to clerk at the court were Ted Cruz and John Eastman.
That's what we call a backhanded compliment.
Well, let me get to the compliment part, because what I've seen you do on January 6th, and frankly every day since, sometimes I despair about where the country is, and then I think of you and what you are doing and standing up for in your bravery. And it's, my parents came here from another country. They didn't know what the Constitution was, but they certainly knew what the rule of law was, and you are the embodiment of the rule of law.
Well, who wants to talk about the Athenians now, after that?
So on the Athenians, I go back to Madison and Federalist 10 and 51, which I think is right, because central insight of the founders is the pluralistic, divergent society is actually one that is stronger and more resilient. That because you have so many different factions, you can't have one overarching faction. Now, social media and modern political parties is certainly a challenge to that. But I do think, I don't want to overreact to Trump and Trumpism and MAGA, because I do think that is the core of what America is, and somehow institutions like this need to rebuild and strengthen that core.
Judge Luttig, do you agree? Can we, as a multi-faith, pluralistic society, construct a common core that can sustain democracy?
Maybe. Thank you, Melissa. Neal, thank you, and thank you, Kettering, for having me here today. One word of disclaimer, everything that I say in front of a camera, whether it's right or wrong, I attribute it to Judy Woodruff, the great. A digression just to begin. So Judy, for some reason unknown to anybody, wanted to interview me and out at our house in Vail, and so she landed in Vail and took over my house for 2 days, and we finally got to the moment, and I'm sitting in my own house, and I'm about this far from Judy Woodruff, and we'd all been made up and everything ready, and she says, "Judge, are you ready?" And I said, "No." And she said, "Well, what's wrong?" And I said, "Well, I need to take just a moment to compose myself." I said, "You have to understand, Judy, from my perspective, I'm sitting in my own home about to be interviewed by Judy Woodruff. This will take some time. I'll get back to you as soon as I can." No, I want to start at the beginning, which was January 6, 2021. I testified in front of the House Select Committee 2 years ago in June. And the first line of that testimony was something to the effect that a stake was driven through the heart of America's democracy on January 6, 2021, and today America's democracy is teetering on a knife's edge. I went on in that testimony to say a lot of things, but I also said that Donald Trump and his allies and supporters were that day, only 2 years ago, in plain view of the American public, preparing to overturn this coming election if they concluded such was necessary. And this morning someone sent me an article from the Washington Post. I don't know if it was this morning or yesterday. It was actually from my 94-year-old mother-in-law who lives on an abandoned island in the San Juans. And so she sent me the article around 3 o'clock her time, a.m. And it was the Washington Post article that I'm sure many of you read that quoted and described the fact that the former president and now all of those who are vying to be his vice presidential candidate have now said publicly that they will not necessarily accept the next election, and it will depend on whether they won the election or not. So that's 2 years after I told the Congress of the United States that that's exactly what they were preparing to do in plain view. So beginning on January 6, 2021, but more importantly, today, Donald Trump and his supporters are holding America and America's democracy hostage. There's just no other way to frame it. And I say it that way. First off, remember, I'm a former judge, so I only do fact and law. That's the case as a matter of fact and also law. Much of the discussion this morning and much of the discussion for the past 3.5 years, as you know, has been as if both political parties, certainly, but all of us are facing the most significant threat literally to America's democracy because all of us have failed. That's just not true. We are where we are today because of one man and now one of our two political parties. They have, as I said in my testimony on January 6th, they instigated a war on America's democracy. And I said then that some number of those who instigated that war with the former president were determined to see that war through to its catastrophic end. That's where I believe we are today.
So I take from your remarks that you would view Donald Trump as perhaps the most profound threat to American democracy today. Is that a fair statement?
That would be an understatement. 2 years ago.
Trying to be even-handed here.
That may be the problem. We're here gathered to talk about democracy, and we're asserting profoundly that it's nonpartisan. And that's true. But those who oppose American democracy today, they regard democracy as anything but nonpartisan. It is highly partisan, and it is highly political. And the evidence abounds, but I would just point out that, as I have of late, the intellectual underpinnings of this movement on the far right, intellectual. These are some of the most thoughtful, most brilliant thinkers and writers, and they are talking about literally a revolution exactly like this country had, almost 250 years ago. And there's no, whatever the phrase is, there's no fuzz on that orange, okay? That's what they are saying is needed to return America to we the people.
So with that in mind, Neal,
Let me say, just in case anyone thinks differently, okay? The Democrats are responsible for a lot of bad stuff. They're not responsible for this fundamental assault on America's democracy for the first time in American history.
Right, so January 6th is this major inflection point. There's no going back from this moment, and it's a profound moment, one that I think you would rightly say demands accountability. Right now, there are 4 pending indictments against Donald Trump. 2 of them are directly for the events that gave rise to January 6th. They are unlikely to go forward before the election. We are unlikely to see any kind of resolution in those cases before the election. Neal, is this a failure of our institutions, or is this just evidence of how fragile our institutions have become?
Yes to both. So, the Georgia case, as of yesterday, is now going to be put back for the Court of Appeals to decide the disqualification motion of Fani Willis. That is almost certainly cannot happen before the November election. The Mar-a-Lago case, which is like an open and shut, easy criminal case, is delayed because of pretrial proceedings by Judge Eileen Cannon, and then the January 6th federal one. The Supreme Court had oral argument a couple weeks ago on whether Trump is absolutely immune. This I didn't think was a thing, but they did have a pretty rollicking argument there. That there's some possibility that case can go forward. I disagree a little bit with all the pessimistic analysis. I think the Supreme Court could decide this in June in a way that would allow the trial.
What would
to
that
proceed.
look like? Because I've been one of the pessimists here.
Yeah. So I don't think they're going to say that there's no immunity whatsoever. I think they will say for some zone of official acts, and Michael Dreeben, who's arguing for Jack Smith, I think made that clear, and leave that a little bit to the district court, but with enough guidance to say, look, here we've got an indictment. There's some stuff that's core private acts, as even Trump's lawyer admitted. There's some stuff that isn't, and then it'll also be up to Jack Smith to see how much he wants to pare down the indictment. Mm-hmm. At the oral argument, he was almost given the opportunity, Dreeben was, to pare it down because Trump conceded there were at least 3 key acts that were all fully private.
And the private acts are the ones that would be outside the scope of any
correct.
Immunity.
Yeah, thank you. And Dreeben didn't take the court up on that, but I think that may just be because he didn't have authority to do that. Yes, he was sitting next to Jack Smith, but Jack Smith may not even have authority to pare down the indictment. He may need to go to the Attorney General under the special counsel guidelines. So all a long way of saying, I think there is a possibility that this could happen. I do think that it does demonstrate that our courts, we haven't been focusing as much on who gets on the courts. And some of these decisions I find inexplicable. And I don't know whether you call that a failure of the institution or a failure of personnel or what, but some of these people are not acting like judges. I would just think, I think back to Bush versus Gore, in which I was a junior lawyer, 36 days start to finish. Mm-hmm. 2 different times we went up to the Supreme Court. Courts are capable of acting more quickly, and here you've got a monumental election. You've got a major candidate accused of crimes, and yet the American people aren't going to find anything out about this.
Well, interestingly, the Supreme Court did move with a spirit of urgency and expedition with regard to Trump versus Anderson, the Colorado disqualification case. So I know you, Judge Luttig, filed an amicus brief there about the scope and substance of Section 3 of the 14th Amendment, which Colorado argued disqualified Donald Trump from its ballot. And the court moved relatively quickly to decide that issue. And it ruled that Colorado did not have the authority to disqualify Donald Trump, that in fact only Congress, through congressional legislation, could take steps to enforce Section 3 of the 14th Amendment. Was that the right decision?
Well, they didn't make a decision at all, Professor. But on the larger question, at arguably the most important moment in American history, when the country has needed the Supreme Court most, it's failed. It's failed the Constitution and it's failed the country. It's now clear, and I can say confidently, the Supreme Court's never going to decide any of these issues, ever. They didn't decide them when they were put in front of them. and they're never going to decide them. On the 14th Amendment issue, the so-called opinion was an embarrassment. It's one of the most important cases ever argued in American history. I don't even know what you call the opinion. They called it a per curiam. Arguably, sort of, there were 3 dissents from that. If you define dissent as someone who says the most, biting things that you could say about an opinion that you join. I'd spend the whole afternoon if you'd like to.
All right, we have 15 more minutes. So I'm really interested to hear both of your thoughts about this as avid court watchers. So in this per curiam opinion, the court professed to unanimously determine that Donald Trump could not be disqualified by the state of Colorado from its ballot, that only Congress could do that. There was a separate writing by Justices Kagan, Sotomayor, and Jackson, which said it was a concurrence. It was concurring in the judgment. But as you say, it read very much like a dissent. And it was more pointed and sharp than any separate writing I've seen in a really long time. At 4 points in this separate writing, Justices Sotomayor, Kagan, and Jackson referred to Donald Trump as a quote-unquote oath-breaking insurrectionist. And at one point, they noted that their colleagues in the majority had taken the liberty of sequestering this issue and the court from this broader question of the scope and substance of the 14th Amendment for the purpose of secluding this defendant from it, which to me sort of read like our colleagues are in the bag for Donald Trump. Is that how you read it?
Well, you don't have to go to the argument, but first I want to make the point for our audience that the argument in the 14th Amendment disqualification case was 3.5 hours. Very precious little of that discussion ever discussed the issue in front of the court. From the second argument began until the last minute, I knew to an absolute certainty that the court would never decide the issue. And of course it didn't. Fast forward to the absolute immunity case. Absolute immunity case. As Neal said, I mean, this is like no one in 250 years has ever even thought to make the argument, much less had the courage to make the argument. And the Supreme Court was receptive to that argument. But in that argument too, almost no single question was asked about the only issue in front of the Supreme Court. In that case, in 2.5 hours, there was only one issue in front of the Supreme Court of the United States. One issue. Whether the former president could be prosecuted for attempting to overturn the 2020 presidential election, remaining in power, notwithstanding the vote and will of the American people, preventing for the first time in American history the peaceful transfer of power. Mark my words, there was hardly one single question. As I said, I was on Nicole Wallace. Judy Woodruff, again, is at fault. And I was to be on there for 40 minutes talking about everything but this issue. And 55 seconds in, she turns to me and she says, Judge, the Supreme Court just took the absolute immunity case. What are your thoughts? And I took a moment and then I said, there's not a reason in this world for the Supreme Court to have taken the case, but it's almost a certainty at this point that the court, that Donald Trump will never be tried before the election, and I doubted if he would ever be tried. The court immediately set the case for argument 2 months from then. In the last week of argument, there's not a chance in this world that the Supreme Court will decide that case by the last day of the term. The trial judge had already committed to 88 days for the former president to have a fair trial. If they decided at the last day and if everything else went perfectly, that trial would begin the first week in October, 3 weeks before. But now the court hears the case, doesn't discuss it. What do they discuss? They discuss, well, you know, did he take these acts, the charged acts, in his official capacity as President of the United States or in his private, personal capacity? I can tell you, under the law for 250 years and under the Constitution of the United States of America, it's utterly irrelevant. And the Supreme Court was up there flailing around, asking the poor attorneys, well, what do you think the difference is between his official acts and his personal acts? And Dreeben, who's, you know, one of the greatest advocates of our time, second only to Neal Katyal, Dreeben's sitting there in his mind, you know, one of the thought bubbles they called, he's going, what are you even talking about? This is one of the gravest offenses against the United States of America that could ever be committed by a sitting president other than perhaps treason. Our Supreme Court of the United States is sitting there twiddling its thumbs, knowingly delaying his trial until after the election, and then they're going to send it back to the trial judge who has no clue what they're talking about, and they're going to ask her to decide which of these acts did he commit in his official capacity as President of the United States and which in his personal capacity.
So I've got you really wound up. So Neal, I want you to interject here.
I sure am.
Just a couple things. One is I was actually at the argument, and I agree, Judge, with what you're saying about the overall tenor of the argument. I will say that Dreeben, and it was an hour and 55 minutes into the argument at 11:55, did explain what Trump was accused of in the indictment and what he did to the Justice Department in particular, pressuring them to try and send letters to the state legislatures saying there was election fraud, and then threatening to fire those Justice Department employees who refused to send the letter. And at that moment, you could hear a pin drop in the courtroom. Every justice was paying serious attention. And I think, you know, one of the problems we have here is that Americans don't get to see the court, so you just have to take my word for it.
No, they can listen.
But listening, you don't get actually what the dynamics were in the courtroom. You don't get, for example, that when Justice Sotomayor asked early on to Trump's lawyer, you know, counsel in the Court of Appeals, you said the president could send out Navy SEAL Team 6 and it wouldn't be a crime. Do you stand by that? The lawyer says yes, and you see Justice Barrett go open eyes like this. I mean, sort of things that you are really missing with this, without the ability of the American public to see it through cameras. With respect to your question about the dissents and the rhetoric and so on, I guess I have a different view. First of all, this is a court that is name-calling a lot. Think about Justice Kagan and what she said about your former boss, Justice Sotomayor, in the Andy Warhol
But that was a copyright case.
Yeah, but it's like, you know, it's equivalent of, you know, Justice Scalia's line about putting a paper bag over your head if you wrote that opinion. So, you know, one is I think there's just some sharpness on the court. The second is maybe the three more liberal justices do have that view, but I don't think that they'd want to deploy that and be too express about it. After all, sometimes this court has rendered decisions against Trump. You think back to the 2020 election, the 62 different cases, some of those went to the Supreme Court. They were all denied. Think about the executive privilege case in which the January 6th committee pierced executive privilege, 8-1 decision with only Clarence Thomas dissenting, siding with Trump. So there are instances of the court being able to act impartially and against Trump. And I suspect that the three on the court are trying to make sure that, you know, that they haven't antagonized things, so that's impossible as we go into the 2024 election.
So let me just say, so Neal, as we've established, is currently an advocate in front of the Supreme Court. I'm not. And the other difference between us is I have life tenure and he doesn't.
No, I'm at Georgetown, man. I got tenure. In fact, I think
Neal
you
has-
resigned your life
Well,
tenure.
Neal has many jobs, so it'll be
But,
okay.
but look, of course, what Neal says is right about the argument, but twice before, when Dreeben had tried to make a point about the actual case pending in front of the court. By the way, this is the Supreme Court of the United States. It's not like some county courthouse, right? And so, you know, when Neal says, you know, Dreeben finally got to tell the Supreme Court of the United States what the former president was charged with, just think about that. And I'm willing to accept that that's what was going on. They didn't have a clue until Dreeben said it, but only for sake of this conversation. But twice before, when the court had asked, I mean, Dreeben was trying to argue his case, the court literally had said, I'm not interested in the facts of this case. Quote, I'm asking you about your argument that a president could order his political opponent assassinated and could never be held accountable for it. Now, there's no reason in the world you guys should know anything about the judicial process, but that was, it was unbelievable. Mm-hmm. What you do know is courts decide only the issue in front of it. And that whole argument was about, as I said to Nicole that day, it was about every other issue except the issue.
Judge, I just have to say I disagree. I mean, you know, I think almost all of my arguments at the Supreme Court they will say, this isn't about this case. They're testing the limits and logic of your position for every other case. So I think that is what the job of the Supreme Court is.
I'm going to jump in to defend Judge Luttig here. I think he's right. They are arguing about everything but the issue because they changed the issue in the questions they accepted for review. So yes, the initial question that was put on cert after the discussion in the DC Circuit was whether a president could be absolutely immune. And it's the court itself in granting cert that changed the parameters of the question to specifically probe this question of private versus public actions, which gets us here. So that's, again, another layer of this. My question for Neal, though, is going back to this idea of public participation. Like you've talked about democracy, the people are an inherent part of a democracy. Right now, we're all talking about the courts as if the courts are the last stand, the last bulwark available to check excesses of government power, whether it's the president or Congress or something else. Does it matter that our highest court is so removed from the people? I mean, you've already mentioned the fact that we haven't really made the court a part of progressive politics. That is changing, but it's been a very slow change. You've mentioned the fact that most Americans don't engage with the work of the Supreme Court and certainly the lower federal courts to any degree. Most Americans only know of courts through things like the People's Court or Judge Judy. I mean, is that a failing of our civic culture in the way we talk about courts?
100% it is, and it may have worked back in an earlier time when the court wasn't so interjected into every facet of our political, social, private lives. But now it is, and it's a court that is very much out of step with mainstream America. And so, I do blame the Democrats for that, for 50 years, for neglecting the courts, for talking about other stuff. Whereas the Republicans had a very concerted strategy. It may be because they lost Roe in 73 and were galvanized by it, I don't know. But for whatever reason, you now have a system and a system of courts that is very lopsided. And I wouldn't say it's just in terms of numbers. I would say it's also in terms of intellectual firepower. I mean, if I took a list out in 2020 of the 15 or 30 most prominent intellectual conservatives, many of them now are on the Court of Appeals that Trump put on. And I wouldn't say that about Biden or Clinton or Obama. And so there is a mismatch. And there's just a lack of attention that Dobbs is starting to change that, but we have a lot to do.
So another element of this, I mean, you mentioned the introduction of movement conservatives to the judiciary. A lot of that happened through the Federalist Society and sort of the network of conservative groups within the conservative legal movement. How much does the influx of money and quite a lot of money change the nature of our politics and distort our understanding of democracy? Judge Luttig?
Well, you know, I hate to cause problems here.
You've been spicy all afternoon, so I'm not surprised.
But look, what I do want to say is this. I was on a panel a few days ago with a dear friend, an academic, wonderful, wonderful, brilliant academic, and we were talking about these very issues, same issues. And she was telling the assembled crowd that, and this was her metaphor that she probably wishes she had not used, but she said, look, the house is burning down, and we've got to renovate the house right now. Well, you know, for a non-academic, that was like manna from heaven, right? So when it came back to me, I said, well, I'm just a regular guy. I'm not an academic. You know, the house is burning. All I know I'm smart enough to do is go get water and put out the fire. And I said, and then we can turn the renovation of democracy and the rule of law over to the academics. That's a little bit of what I'm feeling, what I want to say today. In other words, the house is burning. It's going to burn to the ground in the next 6 or 7 months or not. The immediate task is to stop the house from burning to the ground. And if we succeed in that, then we can talk about how to renovate whatever's left of the house. But on the Supreme Court, too, it's like, you know, I know I've got distinct views on what's going on in the Supreme Court, but it doesn't matter. They've told us they're not going to decide the cases, period. So there's no need waiting for the Supreme Court. They have failed us. We've got to go out and try to save this democracy against the onslaught.
So one thing that's actually quite encouraging, and I would say for American women, it seemed very clear that the House was on fire in June of 2022 when this Supreme Court, in a supermajority, upheld a Mississippi law that banned abortion at 15 weeks, and then by a 5-4 vote overruled Roe versus Wade and Planned Parenthood versus Casey, both of which had extended and confirmed the right to an abortion. We saw almost immediately a galvanizing of democratic engagement around the question of abortion, and it's proven to be very potent in terms of turning individuals out at the polls in ballot initiatives, but we've also seen a real fear of democracy, which is ironic because the court's decision in Dobbs professed to return the question of abortion to the states and to the people for democratic deliberation. Now that that deliberation is happening, but it's not proceeding in the direction that Justice Alito had imagined, we suddenly have all of these efforts to limit democratic engagement. So efforts to limit ballot initiatives, efforts to cut down the scope of certain ballot initiatives that can be put before the voters. Neal, what do you make of all of this? For the first time, the American public saw a right that they had been born with withdrawn.
Yeah, it's such a great question. So, I mean, I guess I start with the idea that what Alito said, political engagement and so on is the solution. It's not playing out that way. And so you have not just the ballot initiative and stuff, but even litigation strategies. You know, we have the mifepristone case, which is now pending at the Supreme Court, in which conservatives went and sued the FDA, which had approved this abortion drug been approved since the year 2000, and said, you know, you can't do that. That would just totally topple our entire system of pharmaceutical regulation if this lawsuit were allowed to proceed. And that's an example of the political branches doing what Alito said they were supposed to do, and yet now you have the conservatives coming in and saying, oh no, you can't actually do that. We didn't mean that. That should be off the table. That happens time and again. And I agree that, oh, by the way, and I think mifepristone, we will likely win this case, and I think that'll complicate, unfortunately, the electoral dynamics you're talking about, because the headlines will read, Supreme Court stands up for abortion rights, or something like that, right before the 2024 election, as it happens to be. So I do think it's a complicated thing. I think the thing about your question that I struggle with is that, you know, yes, we have this Dobbs moment, but we haven't had this moment in other things. Like I argued the Voting Rights Act case right after President Obama was sworn into office, the constitutionality of the Voting Rights Act at the Supreme Court. And I remember, you know, it was just an incredibly terrifying thing to have this sacred act and have to defend it. And I remember when we won, John Roberts said in the opinion, you know, we may reconsider this at some point, but, you know, for now, this is the law of the land. And then he goes and reconsiders it, as you know better than anyone, in Shelby County, 5-4 decision to strike down this canonical act, which has, frankly, the blood of patriots on its pages. And what was the reaction to that? I mean, Justice Ginsburg wrote a great dissent, but there's no public reaction. I mean, when I argued the case in 2011, you know, Justice Scalia asked, he said, you know, what was the vote in Congress to reauthorize this act in 2006? It was 421-3 in the House and 98-0 in the Senate. You don't have that constituency anymore for the Voting Rights Act, for like the ability of people to vote. Something deeply rotten has happened in our politics, and unfortunately, the political channels don't seem to be grabbing hold of that.
So can I come back to that? Like in the last conversation between Brad and Sarah, Sarah mentioned that there seems to be a divide about what we think are the core things that America's about, the things that America does well. And you know, we all know what America does well. Do we all know that? I mean, that is, as I was listening, that was something that I wonder. I think some people have an idea of what America is good at, and I think it's fundamentally different from what other people may think. And your response about the Voting Rights Act, I think, taps into this. Do we have two fundamentally different ideas about what American democracy looks like for different groups of people?
Well, of course we do. I mean, right, if your African-American democracy didn't mean much to you for a long period of time, it doesn't mean the same thing as it does to other folks. You know, but I do think we do have a common set of goals, and not goals like the Soviet Constitution, like aspirational crazy stuff, but stuff that is often achievable, maybe not for everyone, but for some people, and the goal is to try and expand that out to make it available to all. I do think that's the DNA of what our country is. It's the founder's vision. It's the vision of every immigrant who comes here, like my parents. And I do think, you know, I don't want to give up on that, and you know, and I don't want to toss it out. So I want to fight for it the way that Judge Luttig is talking about.
You know, Professor, we for 250 years we had shared views of all the values and principles on which this country was founded, and on the basis of which it had become the beacon of freedom and democracy to the world.
Were they always shared by everyone? I mean,
yes, they were.
No, I'm going to push back on
unless this, and this is what I was going to say, what I think is wrong with your thinking about it, when you get off into individual issues of policy, like abortion, like civil rights, that's not my definition of democracy. Today.
I don't disagree. I think where I'm coming from, and I think what's underlying my question is, like, we have had a set of shared values, but not everyone in the polity has had a role in constructing them, right? Women didn't vote until 1920. Black women didn't have the opportunity to participate in the political process until well after that. I mean, so when we talk about shared values, who is sharing them, right? I mean, and it is a genuine question. It's why I started the panel with that first question. Can we genuinely talk about core common values when, in fact, our models for democracy have depended on homogeneity?
Well, you know, so I'll digress into politics of the day. And I don't do politics, but all of us, I think, believe we can do politics better than the politicians, right? If Joe, and this is, I almost feel dirty even saying this, I've never said anything this political, but if President Biden and the Democratic Party run against Donald Trump and the Republican Party on these issues that you're talking about, you can expect that all the Republicans will vote for Donald Trump. And based on the statistics today, the polls, that Joe Biden will lose the election. The only way, in my view, politically, for the current president to win against Donald Trump now, because Donald Trump has won the past 3.5 years. He has normalized all of his conduct, all of his rhetoric into American society and America's political culture. And right now, many millions of people don't believe in the integrity of our elections. They don't believe in our democracy itself. He has won millions and millions of Republicans to that. So the way I talk about it is, he has succeeded in making this election only about which man is better to lead the country going forward, as if nothing in the past ever happened. So if you start arguing as the Democrats, well, look, you got to elect Joe Biden because of what the Republicans are doing to abortion, that's music to the ears of the Republican Party, and they're going to fall right in line behind Donald Trump.
But that got to be an opinion. That can't be, I'm sorry, that cannot be the truth. Because first of all, we got 30 million poor people who don't vote. Voting rights is not a political issue. And the minute you discuss it as that, you don't own the fact that John Chapman said that every time we had a conversation in this country, racism and slavery was like a serpent in the Constitutional Convention. I appreciate, I think you're right in a lot of things, but we're throwing around opinions, just like we're not talking about actual numbers. The numbers tell us that if 20% of poor, low-wage folks that have not voted were to vote in this election, in most states 10%, they could fundamentally shift the electorate. That's 55 million poor, low-wage voters. The problem is, we're not talking about if you get elected, you're going to get a living wage. If you did that, you would inspire another 55 million people, and you'd only need a group of them to vote. And if they did, in states like Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, Florida, it wouldn't take but 2% of poor and low-wage voters that didn't vote to go to the polls and vote. And every time living wage, for instance, is on the ballot, it polls at 72%. But that's a core value as well. That's not Republican.
You're exactly right, Reverend. And I wasn't referring to voting rights as an issue.
It's not an issue. It's a core to this democracy.
I agree.
And it's not a black issue. Because 50 million Americans have been hurt by what happened to the Voting Rights Act, not black folk. The problem is even we as black folk have allowed it to be a black issue, and as she said, there should have been an outcry from white, black, brown, and everybody on June 25th, 2013, when the Voting Rights Act was gutted. There should have been mass movements in the street, and civil rights organizations failed. Democrats failed, Republicans failed, because we have not fixed that voting right, and 1,000 voter suppression laws have been pushed and passed in state. If voting rights is not core to this democracy, and it is seen as a political issue, not only is the house burnt down, it's burning, it's already burnt.
I couldn't agree with you more. My only point was not as to voting rights. My political point, although I didn't address voting rights, but my political answer to you, political, and you know this, that will not resonate with the Republican Party base.
When we did borrow money in North Carolina, 16% of Republicans marched with us and went to jail. 16%. We sent a Republican governor home. We sent a Tea Party home. It's how you build. As long as we keep talking about left and right and center, that language is too puny, it's too small for this moment. I do not believe that the majority of Republicans would not join if we connect voting rights to abortion issues, to living wages, and help understand that that's a issue, but it's not just one issue, it's connected. I'd love to have this conversation with you in public.
I'm going to have this conversation in 15 seconds. This has been about institutions. It's been about fragile institutions, precarious institutions. I think the most significant threat to our democracy is not just Donald Trump, but a failure to galvanize the entire public around a core set of values about what it means to be a democracy. We have rampant gerrymandering, which makes it possible for the majority to see their wishes completely overrun by the tyranny of the minority, because these minority gerrymandered legislatures don't have to be responsive to all of their constituents. That's how you get a bill like HB 1510, which was upheld in Dobbs, the Mississippi ban on abortion at 15 weeks. It's why you get laws that continue to disenfranchise wide segments of the population. It's why you have people going to the polls for direct democracy to enshrine abortion rights, because their views are not being mitigated through representative government. They can directly register their responses. I teach young people every day at New York University, and we have to find a way to talk to them across parties, across generations, in a language that will resonate with them. It's not just that those who are under-resourced or poor are a huge voting bloc that's untapped. The young are a huge untapped resource. This election could completely turn on voters between the age of 18 and 30. And we have to figure out how to address them right now, because they are entirely disaffected, disengaged, and tired of politics as usual. And so I am so glad we had this conversation today. I will also confess, Judge, that like Neal, I was afraid to apply for a clerkship with you, in part because I had a sense of what Ted Cruz would become, and I wasn't sure I wanted to be a part of that.
That was low. That was low.
But we are not our worst moment, and I will say that. So,
but to show you what a good guy I really am,
you're the best
my last
guy.
comment is just going to be, we have 5 months, period.
To get it all together. We have 5 months to get it together. Okay. So, to the Kettering Foundation and the Rockefeller Foundation, thank you so much for this spicy, spicy conversation. Thank you to Judge Luttig and Neal Katyal, the very best of our society, like working on these issues every day. It's been an absolute pleasure. Even in our most fractious, we know what we're talking about, and we know the importance of these questions for ourselves and for everyone in this room. So thank you.
Thank you.
Wow. Thank you for that. Thank you, everyone, for that. I'd like to bring Sharon L. Davies back to the stage, if she's ready. She looks ready. To draw the final pieces of that through line that I referred to earlier. Sharon Davies.
So the word of the day, spicy. Spicy. The Kettering Foundation does democracy in a spicy way, evidently in partnership with the Rockefeller Foundation. I want to thank every one of our speakers today and our extraordinary moderators as well. Many of them are senior fellows of the Kettering Foundation, and so much more to this nation. We see them every day. They are tireless in their efforts to fight in defense of our democracy. And we are so fortunate to be able to call them fellow citizens, citizen warriors for our democracy. As we wrap up today, I want to circle back to the affirmation that framed our discussions. Democracy is not partisan. And as you could tell, I think our speakers really exhibited that despite wherever it is that they fall on the political spectrum, they are in agreement about one thing, and that is our democracy is in jeopardy, and we all have a role to play in preserving it. So I am inspired by their examples, and we may have different ways of thinking how we can go about defending democracy, and it's all right for us to disagree on strategies and tactics. The important thing is that all of us are engaged in that fight. And as the judge just put it, we have 5 weeks to put out that fire. Oh, sorry. Thankfully, it's not 5 weeks. We have 5 months to put out that fire. So I think it's a call of action, really, to all of us to think about what role that we can play in helping to put that fire out. And then after we do that, then we can get down to our contentious, sometimes disagreements about very important things in our democracy, but we will at least have the comfort that our democracy has held. We are thrilled at the Kettering Foundation to be a part of that work. We thank each and every one of you for being here today, and we look forward to how we, as individual citizens, are going to be a part of that work together. There has never been anything more terrifying to would-be authoritarians than the power of we. That first small word that starts our founding charter, we the people. And our interest in the conversations today, I think, is proof that we know when we work together, and that we must work together, that we have the power to preserve our democracy. So thank you very much for being here. I look forward to being in partnership with all of you in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Sharon. Thank you to the amazing panels we've heard from today: Judy Woodruff, Kathleen Sebelius, Christine Todd Whitman, Sarah Longwell, Melissa Murray, Neal Katyal, and Judge J. Michael Luttig, and Reverend Barber. You have just seen the tip of the iceberg of what goes into mounting an event like this, and I would like to single out a few people who made it possible, if you would indulge me. Kate Schneider, Darla Minnick, and Caroline Parati have made the trains all run on time. Thank you. Director of Communications Melinda Gilmore and her team of Sarah Murphy, Jamal Bell, and Kenny McGuan make us look terrific in all ways. Thank you. Co-chair of our speaker series, Derek Barker, a political theorist, is always there to provide deep structure. Thank you so much. Thank you, too, to my colleagues in the Kettering Foundation leadership, John Dedrick, Maxine Thomas, Teo Clyburn, Mindy Lebrecht, and, of course, Sharon L. Davies. Thank you so much. Finally, deep, deep appreciation and thanks to our fantastic partners, the Rockefeller Foundation. We are so thrilled to be here with you. Thank you. And finally, thank you to you all for being here. This was an amazing morning and afternoon, and I just hope that you're as amazed as I am. Thank you so much. That's a wrap.